Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's press briefing. Thank you so much for joining us. I am Nubia Enriquez, Communications Director for Chispa Arizona. We are very excited to be here today to share the findings from our new poll of over 500 Latine voters from across Arizona. This is a first poll of its kind to provide insight into what Latine voters in the state care about most when it comes to clean and affordable energy. Chispa Arizona commissioned this poll because our state's ability to have clean energy and the actions of the Arizona Corporation Commission affect Latina communities' lives in a very direct way. And we wanted to know if Latina voters are aware. So we partnered with Embold Research to conduct the poll. You should have received our embargoed press release this morning. If you have not received it, please email me. Our team will drop my email address in the chat for you all. We also want to make a quick note that this press briefing is being recorded and it will be made available to you after the call. We will have two options available for media to ask questions during the call. You can submit a written question via the Q&A chat feature at any point throughout the call. We ask that you please identify yourself, including your name, your media outlet, along with your question. And then following open remarks, there will be an opportunity for a live Q&A during the webinar. And we will address all questions at that time. I'll also be sharing logistics at that time as well. For the sake of time, we would like to reserve the questions to members of the media only. I'm happy to answer any questions offline for the organizations that joined us today. So joining me in today's press briefing, we have Trenton Marlar, analyst for Embold Research. And we also have Vianey Olivarria, Executive Director for Chispa Arizona. As I mentioned, after the presentation portion of the call, we will have time for questions. And to kick us off, I am going to hand the mic to Trenton Marlar, analyst for Embold Research, and he will be sharing the key findings and the methodology of the poll. Trenton, whenever you're ready.
All right, thank you, Nubia. It does look like I need the screen sharing permissions, or we need to stop sharing for a second. Okay, it should be set now. All right, I think we are set. Thank you, Nubia, for the introduction. Just to reiterate, my name is Trenton Marlar, and I'm an analyst with Embold Research, and I'm joined by my colleague Flora Mendoza, our Senior Accounts Director. And we're here and excited to walk you through some of the findings of a survey we conducted in April of Latine voters on behalf of Chispa Arizona and the League of Conservation Voters. In this survey, we explored attitudes towards clean energy in the state and voters' perceptions of the Arizona Corporation Commission and its recent actions. And this research provided us a rich set of data and lots of interesting insights. In the interest of time, going to present just some of the key takeaways, but would be happy to speak to some of the other findings as requested later on in the presentation or in the Q&A. To give you a little bit of our methodology for this survey, we surveyed 520 Latine voters across the state of Arizona in April. And we're really excited about this sample because so often we see large survey samples that only have very small portions of the overall sample be Latine voters. And so to have a sample entirely comprised of this demographic group is really important and allows us to speak to their particular concerns and attitudes with a high level of confidence. So this survey was conducted online in both English and Spanish, and respondents were recruited to the survey using our proprietary methodology, dynamic online sampling, which involves both digital advertisements and text messages to direct people to the online survey. After performing weighting, we had a margin of error of 4.5% plus or minus. And to give you an overview of our sample, this sample does reflect the Latine electorate. And I just want to be clear that the population of Latine registered voters will look different from the total state population. So we were particularly targeting active voters. And so we see that the sample is pretty equal in terms of representation across gender. We do see that it does skew young, consistent with the electorate. particularly among Latine voters. And we were making sure that the sample represented across the state. So we have nearly 60% of the sample comes from Maricopa County, around 20% coming from Pena County, and then 25% or so coming from other areas of the state. Consistent with the ideological makeup of the Latine electorate in Arizona, a majority of our respondents identified as Democrat. Of those who did identify as Republicans, we did ask whether they self-identified as a MAGA Republican, and we see that of the Republicans, self-identified Republicans, 57% identified as MAGA Republicans. And then finally, just for context, we did find that just over 1/3, 36%, had some existing familiarity with the Arizona Corporation Commission. To preview some of the key findings I'm going to be walking us through. First, we find that over 90% of all Latine voters think that the rising cost of electricity is a serious issue in the state. Consistent with this, we see that there is really strong support for a variety of clean energy sources being used in Arizona, both solar and wind. When it comes to perceptions of the Arizona Corporation Commission, we see that most Latine voters don't have a high degree of familiarity with the Corporation Commission. However, while the voters may not be too familiar with the ACC overall, when we describe some of the ACC's recent actions in the last year or so, we see that Latine voters largely disapprove of these actions and oppose them. And many think that the Arizona Corporation Commission is pushing Arizona in the wrong direction. So to dive into the results, I'm first going to start with just the top energy issues that we see for Latine voters. And as I just mentioned, we see that over 90% of Latine voters think the rising cost of electricity an issue in Arizona is a serious problem, including nearly 2/3 who said it was a very serious problem. In addition to rising cost, we find that large majority, over 80%, are also concerned about the reliability of the state's energy system during the hottest months, including over half who think this is a very serious problem. So focusing both on cost and reliability, we see that these are some of the top concerns for Latine voters. And we also have seen this in other Arizona polling, that these are the issues that Arizona voters overall are just really concerned about. But among Latine voters, we also see a majority are concerned about the pollution that comes from electricity generation in the state and the state's reliance on fossil fuels. So we see some, proclivity to being supportive of clean energy and being concerned about the current fossil fuel use in the state. And consistent with that, we see that nearly 70% of Latine voters are concerned about climate change, including 41% who are very concerned. And to break up the Latine voter demographics, of which groups are more likely to be concerned, consistent with what we see in other polling, it tends to be women, younger individuals, but also those over 65 are concerned about climate change. We also see that college-educated voters and Democrats are the most likely to be concerned about climate change. Notably here, we see near universal concern about climate change among Democrats, but also very high concern among independents. Around 70% of independents were concerned, whereas concern among self-identified Republicans is much lower. Only around a quarter of Republicans were concerned about climate change. To shift to support for clean energy, we want to explore whether or not Latine voters support different energy sources being used in Arizona. And what we see is that there is widespread support for clean energy among Latine voters, a variety of different types. We see there's very strong support for rooftop solar. Over 80% of voters support rooftop, including a majority who strongly support rooftop. There's very little opposition to rooftop solar. Focusing on larger utility scale solar farms, we do see a large level of support as well. Nearly or over 3/4 of Latine voters support solar farms being an energy source in Arizona. We also see around 2/3 support wind energy. So we do see support for a variety of clean energy sources. In addition to solar and wind, we see around a little over half of Latine voters support nuclear power. When it comes to the fossil fuel sources, we see much more opposition to sources like coal and methane gas, with nearly half of Latine voters opposed to coal and around 40% of Latine voters opposed to methane gas. In addition to exploring the support for different types of energy sources. We also wanted to assess whether voters would like to see Arizona adopt higher clean energy requirements for the state's utilities. And this strong embrace of clean energy translates into what we find here, which is that 3 in 5 Latine voters support the adoption of higher clean energy requirements for the state's utilities. And the strongest support is among 18 to 34-year-olds, college-educated voters, and Democrats. After we asked these individuals whether they would support the state adopting higher clean energy requirements, we followed up and asked when they would like to see these requirements adopted. And we found that among those that support higher requirements, 2 in 3 would like to see the state's utilities get 100% of their electricity from clean energy sources by 2040. So there is a strong desire for the state to act and to move the utilities towards relying solely on clean energy. And finally, we also explored Latine voters' perceptions of the Arizona Corporation Commission, or ACC. And first, we started by exploring their awareness with the Corporation Commission without any context or explanation. We wanted to see what the initial familiarity is. And what we do find is that only around 1/3 of Latine voters express that they're at least somewhat familiar with the Arizona Corporation Commission. And importantly, few were expressed that they were very familiar with it. So overall, we see that there is more superficial familiarity with the ACC, but many voters are not sure what the ACC is or what it is doing. When we look at who is most likely to be familiar, we see that there's a lot of correlation with age and income, with older and wealthier voters more likely to report familiarity with the ACC. And I think it's really important to note, however, that while familiarity with the ACC is lower, this isn't particularly surprising. I'll go back to this slide. A lot of voters nationwide, this isn't specific to Latine voters, would not be familiar with the utility board of their state, or even many of the organizations involved with state governance. And so this is not a particularly surprising level of familiarity. But when we actually explore the actions that the ACC has taken and provided voters some context, some non-biased context of what the ACC does, we do see that there is a lot of opposition to the recent actions that the ACC has taken. So we see, in fact, that this opposition far outweighs support for these actions. We explored whether voters support the ACC's approval of the Arizona Public Services rate increase, and we see that there's widespread opposition to this. Nearly 3/4 of Latine voters oppose this rate increase for APS, including over half, or just over half, who were strongly opposed to this action. Similarly, we find that 71% oppose the introduction of monthly charges for rooftop solar customers to connect their systems to the grid. So they're against this action that makes rooftop solar harder to implement and develop in the state. Voters are a bit more divided when it comes to their support for the ACC's repeal of the energy efficiency rules and utility mandates. We found that just over 50% oppose the repeal, while 28% support. Importantly, though, around 21% are not sure whether they support the repealing of the state's energy rules. And so with the context of knowing that there's strong support for clean energy and many Latine voters would like to see the state have higher clean energy requirements, this action that repeals energy efficiency rules and makes it harder to regulate the state utilities is something that Latine voters are mostly against. In addition to testing and exploring actions that the ACC has already taken, we also explored actions that they are considering. So we explored whether voters support decreasing the rate at which rooftop solar customers are reimbursed for the electricity they provide. And overall, we find that 70% oppose decreasing the reimbursement rate. So in other words, they would like the reimbursement rate to stay what it is or potentially increase. There is some divergence here depending on whether people support rooftop solar or not, with rooftop solar opponents being more likely to support decreasing the reimbursement rate. But notably, we saw that there was 85+% of Latine voters support rooftop solar. And so supporters of rooftop solar far outweigh rooftop solar opponents. And finally, after the voters had learned more about the ACC and its recent actions, we asked whether they think ACC is pushing Arizona in the right or wrong direction. And we found that a plurality, nearly half, think that the ACC is moving Arizona in the wrong direction. compared to only 80% who say it is moving Arizona in the right direction. 8%, pardon me. But it is really important to note that many voters still aren't really sure what they think about the ACC and the direction it's pushing Arizona. We see around 45% express that they weren't sure about the direction ACC is moving the state. So there is certainly room for more education on the ACC and its impact on the state, which Nubia and her team will be speaking to more. And those are the poll results, and I'm going to pass it back to Nubia.
Thank you so much, Trenton, for walking us through those findings. I would now like to turn the call over to Vianney Olivarria, Executive Director for Chispa Arizona, who is going to share additional context on why we commissioned the poll.
Thank you so much, Novia, and thank you, Trenton, for walking us through these findings. And I would like to add some context as to why Chispa Arizona commissioned this poll. We're seeing that experts are saying that and predicting that a quarter of voters in Arizona this December will be Latine. And 9 in 10 Latine voters say that the Arizona Corporation Commission is taking the state in the wrong direction. These are the same voters that are disproportionately impacted by 3 key factors: the rising heat in our state, the high cost of electricity, and polluted air, which is why this poll uniquely examines their perceptions of clean energy and the current makeup of the ACC. We all know that Arizona is pretty hot and it's getting hotter. Latine neighborhoods in Tucson and Phoenix, however, are disproportionately impacted by extreme heat. On average, they are 3 to 5 degrees hotter than wealthy areas with predominantly white populations. With Arizona summers getting hotter and hotter, heat-related deaths are on the rise across the state. In fact, just this past weekend, Phoenix recorded its highest ever daily low temperature, following the hottest June in the history of the National Weather Service. With climate change driving hotter and longer heat waves in Arizona, public health officials warn that an energy grid failure during a heat wave could send over half of Phoenix to the hospital with heat-related illnesses. So it's pretty hot and it's pretty concerning. The next major concern, of course, is the rising costs and energy affordability. This is a major concern for Arizonans, but especially for Latine voters. 90% of Latine voters say that the rising cost is a very serious issue. The ACC voted just a few months ago to increase energy rates for APS customers and increase fees for rooftop solar. And yet, nearly 70% of Latine voters oppose the decision to decrease reimbursements for rooftop solar customers. In the summer months, when our families are choosing between paying the electricity bill and paying for groceries, we need solutions that allow us to do both, because that's how we need to be able to survive in our city and our state. And last but not least, a growing crisis is our polluted air and the rising of pollution across Arizona. 4 in 5 Arizonans live in a community with unhealthy air, according to the American Lung Association. And the ACC, in a recent decision, also appended a long-standing state law requiring environmental review for power plants with units of 100 megawatts or more. According to our poll, only 8% of Latine voters in Arizona believe that the ACC is taking the state in the right direction. These are all factors that make clean energy a top issue for Latine voters, and the polling results make it very clear that it's time for the ACC, for a new ACC that embraces clean, affordable, and renewable energy. Nearly 3 in 4 Latine voters agree that Arizona should produce as much clean energy as possible. We have over 360 days of solar. There's absolutely no reason that we should not be leading in this. That is why I'm very excited to announce that Chispa Arizona, after years of organizing and mobilizing and continuing to engage communities, especially communities of color and Latine communities, we will also be launching a 6-figure bilingual campaign to raise awareness about how the ACC's decisions affect the daily life in Arizona. This campaign will focus on Latine communities throughout the state. It will emphasize ACC awareness and accountability for them, and include billboards, radio ads, print ads, and mailers. And with that, I will pass it back to Nubia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vianney. And we are now going to transition to use the remainder of our time to take questions. So the logistics for that, if you'd like to submit a question in writing, please use the Q&A feature in the webinar. If you'd like to ask a question live, please use a raise your hand feature. And once you're recognized, we will unmute your line and you'll be able to ask your question live. We'd appreciate it if you can state your name, your outlet, followed by your question. And if you're joining us by phone, you can press *9 to raise your hand and our team will unmute your line and announce when it's your turn. Again, that is *9 if you're on the phone to raise your hand to ask a question. Again, I would like to remind people that it would be great if we could leave the question part for media outlets exclusively. And I'm happy, like I said before, to answer any questions offline for the organizations in the call. So we can start our question and answer portion now, and I'll be checking the Q&A chat and seeing if anybody has their hand raised. All right, we have one hand raised. We have Valeria, who would like to ask a question.
Hello, can you guys hear me?
We can.
Perfect. So my name is Valeria Rodriguez. I'm a reporter at KYMA in Yuma, Arizona. And obviously, I'm pretty sure you guys are pretty familiar that Yuma is a very, very hot. Just kind of what does this kind of come in play with cities that are really hot?
Can you repeat your question?
Yes. So how does this kind of come in effect when it comes to cities that are really, really hot like Yuma?
Yes. Thank you, Valeria. I can take a shout out if Anuya, feel free to jump in. Yes, we're very much aware that Yuma is pretty hot. It's one of the hottest cities in Arizona, and it majorly impacts, a lot of the outdoor workers who tend to be Latine workers as well. The ACC regulates utilities across the state, right? So if the ACC is not holding these utilities accountable, people in Yuma, in Tucson, in Phoenix, all of them, the impact is statewide. It's even beyond that, right? Because it doesn't just end at the border of our state. So a lot of these actions that the ACC is taking, whether it's for energy regulation or water or corporations or whatnot, they have a direct impact on people's personal economy specifically, and the ability for them to be able to pay their electricity in the hottest months. So that is a huge impact just statewide. The average electricity bill has gone up $10 since the ACC approved these increases. And we're seeing this more and more, especially with our members. Some of our members have had situations where they paid up to $400 a month to be able to survive. And this impact is just felt statewide, throughout the desert.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vianney. And I think it's important to mention, to echo Vianney's point earlier, that our communities are having to choose between buying groceries and paying their electricity bill. And because the Arizona Corporation Commission is an entity that has power over how much we pay for utilities, it is so important that our communities across the state are aware of this and that they have a say in who represents us. Gracias, thank you, Valeria. I also see Joan's hand up.
Hi, thanks for doing this. I'm the climate reporter at the Arizona Republic. I had to step away for a second, so I do apologize if you covered this and I missed it, but I have several questions. I'm wondering what kind of efforts went into the wording of the poll questions to ensure that they weren't misleading. I'm sure you thought of this and made those efforts. I'm just curious to hear a little bit more about that. And then I can list all my questions now, or we can go one by one, whatever you prefer.
Let's go one by one. We'll make it easier. And Trenton, if you want to get into this question.
Yeah, so to respond with that, we are always striving to make sure that our questions are balanced and not necessarily tipping the scales one way or the other. And so I think this was especially important with this survey, considering many voters lacked a high degree of familiarity with the ACC. We wanted to make sure we were providing a non-biased, objective brief explanation of what the ACC does after we or before we then laid out some of the actions. And we put a lot of effort into making sure we weren't using loaded language, and we had several stages of review to ensure that this was something that was presenting the results or the actions as is, instead of diving into necessarily the consequences or benefits one way or the other, just laying out what the broad takeaway of the actions were. So we put a lot of effort and thought into ensuring we weren't tipping the scales in our favor.
Thank you.
Reach out to engage civically to make sure that they are talking to the representatives, right, who are elected to represent them and their values and other values of corporations. So that's the key aspect of this awareness campaign, is to just make sure that people actually know that this entity exists and is having power over their lives.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, in terms of measuring how well that's working, though, if you repeated the poll using the exact same questions, it would be a pretty reliable way to look at if that 8% awareness of the ACC actually went up as a result of the awareness campaign.
Yes, the short answer to that is yes, but it will be after the end of the awareness campaign.
And when is that happening?
We're continuing as long as the ACC is making bad decisions. We're continuing the campaign.
Okay, so there's no set end date. All right, and then I have one more question, if you tolerate it. So I'm also just wondering, kind of zooming out of it, those were more detailed questions, but this is a big picture question. So it seems like with 25% of voters in Arizona being Latine, it's looking from this poll like a lot of them would put likely, based on clean energy issues, prefer a Democratic candidate when they head to the polls. What are the other issues that you think might pull them in different directions, that might kind of counteract their support for clean energy when they are actually voting?
Yeah, I can answer, but I know Trenton also ask more like, what are the issues that people care most about? Climate is an issue that is economic, it's healthcare, it's definitely around safety. So I don't think that there's issues that are pulling away people from each other. I think these issues are intersectional with each other. Latinos have for a long time been thought as a monolith. They only care about immigration. They only care about jobs. They only care about education. And that is not true. Latinos are some of the strongest supporters for climate. So when they're voting for issues that are more economically just, when they're voting for issues that are around reproductive justice, when they're voting for issues that are around public education, they're voting for climate. And climate is the same way. When you're voting for clean energy, when you're voting for affordability, that is an economic issue as well. But I know that there was also a poll question around this. I don't know if Trenton, you want to name it as well.
Well, I guess I'll be a little more specific. I mean, one issue that comes to mind for me that has been a big deal lately is abortion, right? So what do you anticipate being the end result of these kind of sometimes conflicting values when you have to choose between two parties?
I think there's an assumption made that there may be conflicting values. What I think it's true is that our polling showing that most polling is showing that abortion is a very strong issue for all Arizonans, not just Latine. And I think that when you are testing that, and when Latinos are aware Latino voters are aware of the impact of, for example, climate, they vote in accordance to their values, and those values tend to be very intersectional. So I don't think there is a situation where a voter is against climate, they don't believe in climate change, but they believe in abortion rights. I think voters understand that their rights and what they deserve as a dignified way of life is very much connected to each other.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Joan. And we do have two questions in the chat. First, we have Greg Han with KJZZ Public Radio. Can Trenton explain what dynamic online sampling is, how people responded, and why 520 people were chosen for the sample size?
Yeah, I'm happy to walk into that. So dynamic online sampling is my company, Bold Research's proprietary methodology that we use to field our surveys. All of our surveys are conducted online, where people can take the surveys on their own devices, whether computer, tablets, phones, what have you. And this dynamic online sampling process, how it works is it lets us recruit respondents for our online survey through digital advertisements on social media platforms, as well as through text messages with a link directing them to the survey. The dynamic portion of this just is that this technology allows us to adjust our fielding strategy as the survey is literally happening by, changing how much we focus on some ads or what text messages we send. And this helps us ensure that we get a representative sample. So if we see that one demographic group is getting, we're reaching the number we're trying to aim for, we can lower our focus there and concentrate on other groups, which gets us a more accurate sample to start. Of course, we still would apply survey weighting after that to ensure that it aligns with census or what we see in terms of the registered voter population. In terms of how they took the survey, I think that was the second portion of the question. They were taking the survey on their own device online. They were able to start and stop and proceed as they wish. And the sample size of 500 allowed us to get a sample that is reflective of the Latine electorate across key demographics. So we wanted to make sure that we were able to not just capture a small group of people, but really get the diversity of Latine voters throughout the state. And so this is representative across key demographics like age, gender, education, partisanship. And in terms of the actual sample size, we were able to get a margin of error of 4.5%, which provides us a pretty high degree of confidence with the results that we have presented, especially the ones where we see really strong support for clean energy or really strong opposition to these actions. Even accounting for the margin of error, we still see the broad takeaway would be that voters are supportive of clean energy and oppose these actions. And I just want to highlight, as I was mentioning earlier in the methodology section, a lot of the polling that we see these days is really just, the whole state, and the Latine segment of those samples tend to be pretty small and really limits the insights that we can learn from this group that is, as we've been mentioning, is not a monolith and has really specific preferences and variance across the group itself. And so we're really proud and happy that we were able to get a robust sample of Latine voters specifically, instead of trying to make insights from just 100 people or so that we would maybe see if we did a statewide survey of everyone. So it really allowed us to learn the key attitudes of this part of the electorate.
Thank you, Trenton. And we do have another question in the chat. This is from Reagan Priest with the Arizona Capital Times. What is the exact dollar amount for the advertising campaign?
Yes, the exact dollar amount right now is 200,000. And we, as I mentioned earlier, there's no end date to the campaign, because we will keep working with our team to make sure that we are continuously continuing the campaign. So that may increase as it goes. And as long as the ACC decides to make decisions that are not in favor of ratepayers and the environment, we will continue to hold them accountable.
Thank you, Yanni. And we do have a hand raised from HS.
Yes, thank you. My name is Horst Schmidt. I'm from Gilbert, and I was reading recently that the candidates for the ACC this year are in two slates. One I could characterize as pro-business, and one is pro-people. And I also saw that there are going to be 11, what do you call it, ballots for um, that the legislature put out into the ballots. And so I'm wondering two things: how to identify the pro-people candidates, and how to provide some help in terms of the sheer volume of voting that has to be done for each voter. So is there any plans in that area for you?
Thank you for your question. It is going to be a very intimidating ballot. I think one of the largest ballots we'll see. At Chispa Arizona, we have 3 different entities, right? We have our C3 and C4 entities, and also we have our Chispa Arizona PAC entity. So for more news and more of that electoral side, will come through the Chispa Arizona PAC. I will say throughout the year, Chispa Arizona engages actively in civic engagement and voter education and voter engagement. And one of our goals is to make sure that voters understand what the ballot looks like, what is in the ballot, where can they go vote, what are the laws around it as well. And that, to your point, will require a lot of robust education to voters to ensure that they are aware of all the things that will include. It is a tremendous task, I think, for all folks and all Arizona and the electoral, the election officials as well, to make sure that people are aware of what is going to be on this ballot.
Thank you, Vianney. And we do have another question in the chat from Valeria, KYMA. And it is, does the campaign start today?
The short answer is yes. We're continuing the campaign. As you said, we're planning to do radio, billboards, ads. It is a little bit of a rolling out system, but I know that, Nubi, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit to the art piece of it.
Yeah, so at Chispa Arizona, we do a lot of art-based awareness activities. So we are kicking off a contest next week where we are calling artists to come and attend a workshop with a collage artist, actually. And then based on that, the art that artists create is going to go up for vote. This is going to be art that is related to accountability of the ACC. And so the artwork will go up for vote because a lot of what we want to do is community engagement around this. So once that contest kicks off, I will let people know also if there is interest, because the point of it is to select a winning artist with winning art that we will use in different materials, posters, flyers, mailers, and hopefully billboards. So that's going to be part of what's coming up the earliest after this call. Okay. And I don't see any more questions in the chat or hands raised. So we'll give it maybe 30 seconds to let people decide if they have any last minute questions. But in the meantime, thank you all so much for being here. This is such an important part of our work, of the work of Chispa Arizona. Like Vianney mentioned, this awareness and accountability work has been going on for years. We do have a membership of about 300 people, and we have a robust list that we share information with digitally, as well as through our social media platforms, because it's so important for our communities, not just the Latina community, but the community in general in Arizona, to know the power that the Arizona Corporation Commission has over their daily lives. So it's very important for us, and we're very grateful that you all chose to come to this briefing today. I don't see any more questions, so I can give people the gift of time back. Like I said, thank you all so much for joining us today. I hope that the call was helpful, that the information we shared here was helpful. And if you haven't received our press release yet, or if you have any other follow-up questions, please email me. My email was dropped in the chat earlier. I'm happy to answer any of your questions, and hopefully we stay connected to continue giving coverage to this issue in the next coming months. Thank you all very much, and have a great rest of your day.